Parents of neurotypical kids don't want to see their kids as sexual beings. But when you add disability and autism into the equation, it becomes even more of a challenge. There's this fear. But what I like to say is that we as autistic people are entitled to the dignity of risk, which means that we're entitled to go out into the world and have our hearts broken, because sometimes the only way you can learn how to deal with having a broken heart is by having your heart broken. We have the same desire to love and to be loved that other people do. The challenge is finding people who will honor and respect that love and treat us the way that we deserve to be treated. For me, I repeatedly have found myself being someone that others, men particularly, have used to feel better about themselves. They have been in places of whatever it was, they needed an ego boost, and they found me perhaps convenient for that purpose. But then I'm left bereft, and I'm left feeling like I'm good for the short term, but not wanted for the long term. And that's been a very painful thing. And I've had to, as I said, develop that ethos of, if you can't handle my tears, you don't deserve my cheers. That's what that means.
Welcome back to the Plenty of Husbands podcast for women who are older, wiser, and hotter. This is where we inspire single women in midlife to believe they can love again. And I'm your host, Robin Fisher-Roffer. Now, today I'm thrilled to welcome Amy Gravino, an exceptional relationship coach. She's a professional speaker and autism sexuality advocate. Amy specializes in helping autistic adults navigate the often murky waters of dating, relationships, and sexuality, bringing a much-needed voice to a community that is often overlooked. She's on a mission to ensure that love is accessible to everyone, regardless of your neurodiversity. With a powerful philosophy on love, Amy lived experiences as an autistic woman. She's enriched her advocacy for better outcomes and quality of life for autistic individuals and all people with disabilities. Now, how big is this population? Approximately 1 in 44 children in the U.S. is diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder, or ASD, according to the CDC. Now, this means that the number of adults on the spectrum is significant, as many individuals diagnosed in childhood continue into adulthood. So in this episode, we'll dive into the importance of comprehensive sex education for all and how it can benefit both autistic individuals and those on the spectrum, what it truly means to love and be loved in midlife, especially for those navigating unique challenges. Amy Gravino, welcome to Plenty of Husbands.
Hi, Robin. Thank you so much. So happy to be here today.
I'm happy you're here too, because we need to give voice to this very important population, which you're a part of. And I want to, and I'm sure all our listeners and viewers are interested in how you came to this work and your own personal love story. Can you share that with us?
I would love to share my own personal love story and how I came to do this work, which admittedly and unfortunately not a lot of people are doing, and that we need more people to be engaged with. But for me, it was almost sort of inevitable, because I'm an autistic adult myself, and I was diagnosed at the age of 11, which was kind of a rare thing at that time, because very frequently girls and women on the spectrum are underdiagnosed and misdiagnosed. So it was sort of amazing that I did receive the diagnosis then, but nobody really understood what autism was at that particular point. Nobody had any knowledge of autism. There wasn't a national conversation on autism. Now April is World Autism Awareness and Acceptance Month, but that was not the case back then. And so as I stood on the precipice of puberty and poised to go through the same physical and biological changes as my neurotypical or non-autistic peers, I really had no blueprint, no guide, nothing to help me figure out what that was going to mean for me as an autistic young woman, as an autistic girl. And so I had the same questions and curiosities as my neurotypical peers, but I had no outlet for these things. Because of the social challenges that I faced, as many people on the spectrum have challenges with social skills. Oftentimes, I like to say that it's not just that we as autistic people have challenges with communication, but neurotypicals have a hard time understanding autistic communication as well, and understanding how we communicate and how we see the world. And that was certainly the case for me, and I certainly felt a lack of acceptance for who I was. So very early on, it was clear to me that, especially when it came to relationships and love, that that was something that was not for me. And it was further reinforced by my peers. I have a distinct memory when I was in high school, maybe ninth or 10th grade, of having a crush on a boy. And I thought I was being subtle, but obviously I wasn't, because that's not something I'm great at. My classmates came up to me one day and said, "You're not allowed to like him." And that phrase stuck with me, not allowed. That suddenly my self as a human being, as a sexual being, as an autistic person, that I needed to have permission to love someone else and to be loved. And that is not a position anybody should ever be in, or anything anyone should ever be made to feel. But that tone was set from very, very early on. At the same time, I never felt any real sense of shame around sexuality itself. We live in such a puritanical society. The legacy of the Puritans is gigantic belt buckles and repression, which is not a great thing. And what that's led to is that we don't have honest conversations about sex and relationships. We talk about things in a kind of a coded language. We have so many euphemisms for penis. We have so many euphemisms for sexual intercourse, but an arm is just an arm. Call an arm an arm. So for autistic people who have these social communication challenges, trying to navigate relationships and dating is like learning another language. It's kind of, when we think about the emojis on our phones, right? The symbols on our phone have one meaning on the surface, the eggplant, and the peach and the raindrops, but there's a whole other meaning to them that's been ascribed. And if you don't know those meanings, if you don't know that hidden language, you're going to have a really difficult time being part of that conversation, right? But with autistic individuals, the fault is often laid on us. The burden is often placed on us. We're made to feel that we're the ones who are broken, that we're the ones who don't understand how everybody else is communicating. And at the point I'm at now, I would say I think we need to revamp and overhaul the way we are communicating about these things, because it's not working. It's not working not just for autistic and neurodivergent people, but for everyone. I think if we were more honest and open, it would help all of us. But this all for me, was starting back then as I began my journey through puberty, through adolescence, trying to develop relationships and failing to develop relationships. And I didn't have my first boyfriend until I was in college. And prior to that, my way of navigating and exploring my sexuality was to write. I'm a writer. I've been writing since I was a kid. And what began with poetry and short stories became erotic fiction when I was around 14 years old, reading it, because they say that men watch their porn and women read their porn, and that was certainly true for me. I always preferred reading. And interestingly, I found myself predominantly reading what's known as slash fiction, or male stories, because there are gender roles that are inherent in male-female stories, whether we're watching them in movies or on TV shows. And I found it very limiting and very difficult to imagine myself in these female roles. I felt like I don't look like that. I don't have breasts like that. I don't know what to do. But it was much more freeing in these other stories where I could be anything. And I wasn't bound by those limitations of my sex. So that became something that was fundamental to my development, my sexual development at that point. But I would write different types of things, and I was a fan of the Backstreet Boys, and I would go into chat rooms on Yahoo with my friends, and they'd ask me to write them a story, write me with AJ, or, me with Brett, and I would write. I was a designated smut writer for our group of friends, as far as my original 15-year-old imagination could stretch, which was pretty far, in all fairness. So I had a lot of time for thinking. And but that was the extent sort of my experience, even though like I said, going through puberty at the same age as everybody else. But I didn't have my first kiss even until I was 17. And that was during a game of truth or dare in an ice skating rink. So that's, not even the most conventional of first kisses either. But, having a boyfriend finally, which was the thing I'd always wanted, the thing I'd longed for, as I combed through the pages of my teen magazines and watched my She's All That movies, thinking I'm going to have this perfect moment and finally have a relationship. A real relationship is a whole different kettle of fish. And I often call him my starter boyfriend because I had no idea what I was doing. But as women, and I think especially being on the spectrum, I found myself sort of deferring to him because he was more experienced, and I didn't know what I was doing, and I still was in that place of low self-esteem, low self-confidence, feeling like I don't know what I'm doing, and he knows better, and I'm the one who's, quote, broken. And that's still not a great place to operate from. And so that was, and he started to, make jokes along the way saying that he was going to dump me for a quote real woman, meaning one with breasts and hips, which I didn't have much of either at that time. And I don't, I don't think I understood why it wasn't okay for him to be saying those things. And I just wanted so badly to have a boyfriend. And I remember when I realized somehow that we were officially dating, the first thought in my head was, so what's going to happen? Are we going to break up? Or are we going to get married? How does this end? You know, because I was trying to intellectualize something that, is not inherently logical. Relationships don't work that way. You don't know what the outcome is going to be at the beginning. But it was such a huge unknown and so overwhelming that I was trying to make sense of it, and I didn't know how to communicate about these things. And so, eventually he wound up dumping me, not once, but twice. And
Heartbreaking.
it was pretty heartbreaking. It was actually nothing compared to what was going to happen next, but just very briefly, this was in my sophomore year of college. And at the time we were living in the same dorm building. I was on the third floor by myself and he was on the first floor with a roommate who was a mutual friend. And one night we're on the front stoop of this building and the mutual friend is out there smoking a cigarette. I'm trying to talk to my friend, and my ex had become very emotionally abusive, but because of the kind of person that I am, whether due to autism or not, I'm very loyal with friendships, and I feel like I have to hold on to friendships very often. So I felt like I needed to stay friends with him, even though there was really no reason to do so. And I said, it's a free country. I have every right to be out here, because he was saying, go away. Nobody wants you out here. Leave us alone. And so I said, no, I'm staying out here. And he proceeded to physically assault me, which sort of sounds worse than it was, but not that it was good. But he was 6'3", I'm 5'0", and he kicked me in the shin and he slapped my forehead with the back of his hand. That was what happened. And we get back into the building and my friend says, Amy, go get the RA. I'll tell her what happened. I'll back you up. Just tell her what happened. Just go. So I wound up going to the RA and I wound up going to the police and filing for protection from abuse order, which is similar to a restraining order. Had to testify in court, and my friend testified on my behalf, and I won the order. And we had an on-campus hearing with the Dean of Student Affairs. The thing I always remember about that stands out to me is that my ex's parents came to this hearing. Not even several months prior, I'd been at their house, and his mother had given me money to go to the mall to buy an outfit to wear to church because I didn't have an appropriate outfit for church. And then in this hearing, she wouldn't even look at me. And it sort of broke my heart because I still was thinking, what did I do? What did I do wrong? I wasn't thinking, no, this is his fault. He's the reason that we're here for this hearing. But it was confusing and painful. But so I wound up winning that hearing, and he had to move out of the dorm building, no third-party contact, and he kind of dropped off the face of the earth, and I haven't seen or heard from him since then. And so it was to that point, like I said, one of the most traumatic things I'd been through. Following that, when you're autistic, you're often made to feel that you don't know what emotions are, that you have to justify things, that you don't know what it is to be in love. Well, I had loved my college boyfriend, but I hadn't been in love with him. And I knew that because I met another guy when I was 22 years old. And it was, again, probably not the greatest place to meet somebody, which was online. It was on a message board. And I was in college in Pennsylvania, and this guy lived in Seattle, Washington. And so in spring break of my senior year of college, one of my friends wanted to go to Seattle to see this band in concert. And I wound up going with her and another friend, and I met this guy in person, fell for him even more. And then after I graduated, I moved out to Seattle. So I grew up on Long Island. I'm a native New Yorker, went to college in Pennsylvania, and then I moved 3,000 miles away from everything, from all my friends, my family, because this is what you do when you're 22. This is exactly, the kind of thing that happens. And like I said, I had opportunities. The things that I always say that my college boyfriend did that were the two best things was that he introduced me to Japanese food and he left me a virgin. So we had done other things, but we hadn't done that. And I'd had other opportunities in college, but I knew that I wasn't ready. And then I decided this is going to be the guy. This is the guy that I'm going to have sex with for the first time. And on that note, I've recently decided to stop describing it as losing my virginity because I didn't really lose anything. And I refuse to give him that kind of credit and that kind of power, which he had over me for a long time. And I'll go more into that in just a moment. But so before I moved out there, I got on the birth control pill and I waited the full month you're supposed to wait for the pill to kick in. Very rule governed. Many autistic people are, because you often hear that young people think they're invincible and nothing can happen to them. Well, I'm autistic and everything's happened to me. So I knew I didn't want to get an STI, and I knew I didn't want to get pregnant. And, I'd done so much preparing with all my erotic fiction reading and writing over the years, and I thought that I was super, super ready. I had the bottle of wine picked out. I had the music burned on the CD. I asked him to wear a white button-down shirt because I always wanted one button a guy's shirt when we were going to make love. And I even purchased a University of Washington Huskies cheerleader uniform because he said he had a thing for cheerleaders. So, we started off the events of the night, in the standard way, as you might imagine. And then at one point he was having some trouble staying in the mood. Interpret that extremely how you will. And I said, okay, close your eyes. I have a surprise for you. And I went into the closet and I put the uniform on, and I lost my virginity. I'll just say it that way for this purpose, in a University of Washington Huskies cheerleader uniform, which is weird, but that is what happened. And the other thing, you know,
I guess you like the uniform.
I guess so. It finished the job, I suppose, in some way or another.
What did you gain, Amy? Because you said, I don't like to say I lost my virginity. I didn't
Mhm.
lose anything. What did you gain?
Well, one thing I gained was the knowledge that in that moment, everything changed and also nothing changed. That, the fundamental fabric of Amy was not suddenly radically altered by having sex, but it was a new experience, and it told me more about myself, at least in that moment, than it did about him. And, one thing that I learned, that's what I was about to describe, is that, there are conversations that you have with a partner. There are conversations you have before, during, and after sex. And I did not know how to have those conversations. That was another thing that, when we have sex education, which is pretty much a farce in this country, we don't talk about the life skills aspect. We talk about pregnancy and biology, but we don't talk about the important, really important things, about how to talk to someone that you want to have sex with and what that looks like. And my way, again, of trying to rationalize this and make sense of something that inherently doesn't, was I thought to myself, well, when you, at least back then, 20 years ago, when you stay at a hotel or you restaurant, they have these cards that you can fill out and you write about what your experience was like. So I created a sexual intercourse comment card for him to fill out. And yeah,
Wow.
I still have it. Yep, yep. And the questions are things like, what did you like most about this sex session? What did you think could have been better? Please rate the following from 1 to 5. My outfit pre-intercourse, my facial expressions, my volume. Is there anything I could do in the future to get you aroused more quickly and maximize your pleasure during our sessions? And he humored me and filled it out for, whatever reason. But there's a problem with those questions. And it was a problem that I didn't realize until many years later with the gift of hindsight. And the problem is that they're all centered around his pleasure and his enjoyment. There is nothing about whether I enjoy myself. And again, I think that's part of being a woman in our society. Unfortunately, we're conditioned to put the needs of others ahead of our own. But also for me, my mindset at the time was, if I screw this up, he'll never want to have sex with me again. Nobody will ever want to have sex with me again. I was very much, there was a reason why the stories that I used to write would end with the guy finishing, but I didn't even know that was something that girls could do until way later on. But that, but that's a whole other thing, whether or not that happens during sex. But I just remember, I'm thinking we're going to be looking into each other's eyes, and it's going to be, but he was 6'5", so I had a wall of torso pretty much right in front of my face the entire time. And right after he finished, he ran into the bathroom to wash himself up, which was, in hindsight, a red flag that I missed. But, another thing I've learned is that when you have rose-colored glasses on, all the flags look red. And,
That's
you
a
know,
great line, Amy. When you have rose-colored glasses on, all the flags look red. Is that what you just said?
that's what I said, yes.
Wow. Okay.
And
I love that. Let me ask you a question just because I have a feeling our first of all, your story's amazing, and I'm
thank
getting so much insight into what is going on in the autistic adult mind or young
mhm.
adult mind when this is going on. For the parents and caregivers of children, young adults on the autistic, that are autistic, what where were your parents during all of this? What was happening with them? And how can those parents out there understand their
Mhm.
dating and relationship needs, the ones that their kids, that are
Mhm.
autistic, the autistic people that they care for, that they love? How can they support them? Where were your parents in all this?
So my parents were taking the very big risk of letting me fly and letting me be out in the world, which I know now that some people had advised them against for various reasons, but was really the best thing they could have done, because if I don't fall down, if I don't make a mistake, how can I know that I can get back up? How can I know that I can survive making a mistake? And so that was not in any way easy for them. I'm an only child. It's not like I have siblings that so I know that they were worried about me, but my parents, the day after I had sex for the first time, the morning after, I called my mother and told her. I'm sure she was delighted. I say sarcastically, but we had forged that close relationship, which had been very rocky when I was in high school. Admittedly, it was a very challenging relationship. But my mother particularly provided a safe space and made it so that I could feel comfortable telling her that. But both she and my father and several of my friends had shared with me misgivings they had. They said, "Oh, Amy, I don't know about this guy. Something seems a little weird." And I thought, well, no, but they're all the way on the other side of the country. How can they possibly know? I'm here. They're not here. And they were right. They were 100% spot on. But I had to learn the hard way, which is just kind of the story of my life. But they picked up on things that I was missing. Again, whether by virtue of being autistic or being in love or both, things that I didn't see or maybe didn't want to see on certain levels. But whenever I talk to parents about this stuff, I mean, there's so much fear, right? So many parents feel this sense of trepidation, especially around sexuality. Parents of neurotypical kids don't want to see their kids as sexual beings. But when you add disability and autism into the equation, it becomes even more of a challenge. There's this fear. But what I like to say is that we as autistic people are entitled to the dignity of risk, which means that we're entitled to go out into the world and have our hearts broken, because sometimes the only way you can learn how to deal with having a broken heart is by having your heart broken. I could listen to songs about it, I could read poetry, but experience was my teacher in this case. It was the thing that let me know that I could survive that. I mean, what ended up happening, was that 6 months later, I found out that this guy had a girlfriend he hadn't told me about, and he was sleeping with half the women within the city limits of Seattle. And yeah, and when I found out, we had intercourse 8 times altogether, and I had counted. And when I found all this out, because he was a coward, I found all this out on the phone or online. There was never a face-to-face conversation. I have not seen him in 20 years. And I'm very much okay with that now, but back then I was very much not okay with that. Because all these other girls were calling up his girlfriend and saying how great he was in bed, but I was the one who fell in love with him. And I became, as a consequence, an easy target. And so
Yeah.
his girlfriend started, and they both started engaging in a campaign of harassment against me, calling me at all hours. He wrote me this email saying his girlfriend also threatened to kill me if I didn't leave town. But he wrote me this email saying, your first time was the grossest thing I ever did. You were just a retarded whore that I keep thinking that we had something. You're delusional. And I mentioned earlier that I'd met him on this message board. And what happened was that his girlfriend went into his account on the message board and posted that email for everybody to read.
God, Amy.
Yeah, this private thing became quite public and became an 11-page thread that everybody was commenting on. And the thing is, it didn't matter that pretty much all the comments were condemning him and saying how terrible he was. It didn't matter that, that the purpose of this was to humiliate him, which I'm sure that was her goal. But I was the collateral damage, and I was still having this thing that was private become public against my will, which is why I actually do find it empowering to talk about it now as part of my work, as part of my presentations that I give in my speaking engagements, because I own it. I own everything that I've been through and everything that's happened to me, and it doesn't have that power over me anymore. But it was very devastating at the time, and I'd never felt anything like that before, to have your heart broken, to become a target, no less. And one thing that I always remember is that about 6 months later, about when the harassment finally ended, he sent me a message online saying, "Sorry for ruining your life." And in that moment, I felt something I had not felt up until that point, because I'd felt hurt, I'd felt heartbroken, I'd felt sad. But when I read that message from him, I felt angry, fully, righteously, clear-headedly angry, because I thought, well, you didn't ruin my life. How dare you give yourself that much credit? I'm still here, and I'm still here now.
Good for you. I love that. I'm guessing from this and the other experience you had in college that coming out of it, and because of the work you do, that you believe that effective communication plays a huge role in relationships, like getting underneath the hood of, who is this guy? Who am I about to sleep with? What do they need? What do I need? So how can that effective communication play in relationships for those on the spectrum, and what strategies can enhance this that you provide in the work you do?
Well, communication is such a tremendous part of relationships. And so much of communication is not just verbal. Something like 80% of communication is nonverbal, right? It's body language, it's reading other people's expressions, picking up on cues. And these are all things that autistic people tend to have a difficult time doing. It can become, easier when it's somebody that we know, when someone we've been able to have the time to get to know and get to know their expressions and their cues. But on that more casual level, when you're getting to know someone, it's a lot more difficult to sometimes pick up on those cues in that nonverbal language. Communication, even within a relationship, right? Even once you've managed to establish a relationship, there's so much communication that takes place within a relationship, and both in and out of the bedroom. That's a huge piece. Things like consent, for example, are very much communication based. I always remember, so I have actually designed a sex ed curriculum for adults on the spectrum called the ASK, the Adult Autism and Sexuality Kit, through my work as a relationship coach in the Rutgers Center for Adult Autism Services. And when I was doing research, for this curriculum, I found a list of nonverbal, non-consenting behaviors that was put on this website. And I'm reading through these, and so many of these are autistic behaviors, but they do not necessarily indicate a lack of consent in autistic people. And so that, right there, just so much of how we view certain behaviors is, correlated to things that are not necessarily what's being expressed by someone who's neurodivergent or autistic. It's like we see this all the time with law enforcement. Police officers are trained to look for suspicious behaviors in people. But so many of those, some or a lot of those are autistic behaviors that don't indicate suspicious behavior or activity in someone who's neurodivergent. There's a misreading on both sides. It's called the double empathy problem. That this is kind of the term that's used, where we often hear that individuals on the spectrum are not capable of expressing or displaying empathy. But in fact, it's a two-way street, right? It's very often neurotypicals, and most displays of lack of empathy that I've seen in my life have been from neurotypicals towards individuals on the spectrum, not the other way around. In actuality, I have found, and for me, I know it's true, it's rather than nothing getting in, it's that absolutely everything gets in. I am a very empathetic person. I feel everything. And I've had to learn over the years to filter things, because otherwise I'll shut down and I won't be able to respond. So that shutdown, that lack of responding, people see that and they think it means that an autistic or neurodivergent person is not feeling emotions. And that's just simply not true.
I'm
And
very
that's
interested in this kit that you just brought up because
yes.
that sounds really intriguing. Within that, is there ways for autistic adults to advocate for their relationship needs and desires without feeling marginalized?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. I mean, that's, the hope of the Ask curriculum is to at least be a starting point for those conversations, right? When I set out to look at this, I mean, sexuality is a massive area, right? There's so much ground that you could cover. And I knew it would be impossible to cover all of it within the scope of the grant that I was awarded to create this curriculum. And so after interviews with stakeholders and looking at things that already existed, I ultimately decided to focus on preparedness for sex specifically, rather than relationships as an entire domain, because it is so huge. But preparedness for sex, and specifically through the lens of healthy relationships and personal safety, which are two content areas from the National Standards on Sexuality Education. They have 7 main content areas, and those were the 2 that we chose to focus on. But there's so much that goes into that, right? Being prepared for sex isn't just, hi, I'm Amy. Are you ready to have, sex now? Let's go. I wish it was that simple, but there's about 100 steps between, hi, nice to meet you, and I'd like to touch your, or I'd like to, you know what I mean? Like, so we can't just, right in there, we can't just teach people who have disabilities or are autistic to say, we can't teach people just to ask permission to touch someone. You can't just meet someone for the first time and then ask, can I touch you? Like that, so that nuance often gets missed, especially in traditional sex ed curricula, obviously. That's something that is just not even covered at all. But even when curricula are put together to try to address sexuality and sexual health for autistic people, sometimes pieces are just not there. People don't think of how many steps there really are for all of this. And so, part of why I've become an autism sexuality advocate is not just to tell my story, but to help other people be able to tell their stories and to be able to stand up and say, yes, I'm autistic. Yes, I'm a sexual being. There's a show that's very, very popular right now called Heated Rivalry, if you've heard of it at all.
Yes,
Yep.
I was going to actually ask you about Heated Rivalry
Yes.
after you said the porn that you like to read was same sex. I was like, because
Yeah.
I'm finding my female friends are really loving
Mm.
it. And now I'm kind of unlocking with you what is underneath that, Amy, is I don't have to put myself as a woman
Mhm.
into that bedroom and into that relationship and judge myself based
Yes.
on what that girl looks like. Did I get that right?
Well, that's part of it, yes, but well, the other thing is that one of the main characters, Shane Hollander, is actually autistic. It's not explicitly stated within the show, but the author whose books the show is based upon has stated that is the case, and the actor who plays Shane Hollander, Hudson Williams, has talked about the character being autistic, and so to have a character who is neurodivergent, autistic, embracing their sexuality in the way this character does is a huge thing that I can't overstate that enough because that doesn't happen. What ends up happening is what I call infantilization, which is where we treat autistic adults as if they're children in big bodies, right? You'll hear this even in clinical terms when people will say, "Oh, this person's 21 years old with the mentality of a 5-year-old." No, this person's 21 years old with the mentality of a 21-year-old who happens to be autistic and has these particular challenges, strengths, and so on. But when we do that, that's what inhibits us from having these conversations. That's why we have the stereotype of many autistic people being asexual. There are plenty of people who are, and that's completely fine and valid. But when it becomes a stereotype for an entire group of people, that really causes so many problems.
So, Amy, I've got to ask you, going back to, because this podcast is for women in midlife who are older,
Hmm?
wiser, and hotter, right? And a lot of them who are listening may have adult children on the spectrum. I think what I hear you say is don't make them into children when they're in their 30s, 40s. That's where they're at. They just happen to be autistic. So,
Mm.
not looking at them all the time as little ones in big people's bodies is
Yes.
important. What else is important for this audience to understand?
I think, very often when people hear about autism, what information they might have about it. Well, as we said, first of all, a lot of people still think of autism as a childhood condition. That is something that children are diagnosed with, but people are autistic for their entire lifespans. You're born autistic and you'll die autistic, and we still don't have the supports and services in place that we need for autistic adults. We don't have information on aging and autism that we really, really need, especially things like menopause and autism. That's a part of, sexuality and sexual health, what it means for physically and emotionally and mentally to grow older while being autistic. That's something that it's just not, we're still so focused on childhood that ends up getting missed. But oftentimes, people, there's a focus on the differences, right? That we're so different, and this kind of othering is what ends up happening. We see autistic and neurodivergent people as an other, as something that's separate from the rest of humanity, which is so incredibly damaging. And which is why, for so many years, relationships were not something that was addressed for this population. Very frequently, if you attend an autism conference, you will see 3 main areas touched on, which is housing, employment, and recreation. Relationships have just always been looked at as optional for some reason.
Mm.
But to deny autistic people our sexuality and the opportunity to explore our sexuality, it's to deny us part of the human experience. It's not optional. It's simply not.
I
We
love
may
that,
need,
Amy.
yeah.
That's so important for anyone who's listening who is a woman
Mhm,
who wants to date, wants to have a relationship, but is an autistic person
mhm.
to hear. Can you share a success story or transformational moment from your work that illustrates the power of connection in romantic relationships, or something that came out of your teaching, your speaking, your kids, that
Mhm.
you saw somebody's relationship transform? You saw the relationship they have with themselves,
Yeah.
become more
Mhm.
powerful and or empowered to go forward into a relationship.
Well, I mean, one that always stands out, I remember it might have been last year or the year before, I received an email entirely, out of the blue from a young woman who'd read an article that I'd written about autism and sexuality. And she said, what you wrote made me think completely differently about my experiences with relationships and sexuality. And it gave me so much hope for what I can achieve going forward. And I remember she ended the email and she said, never doubt that what you do changes lives. And
Mm.
I've gotten awards for my work. I've gotten recognitions. Nothing will ever mean as much as what that person said. I also had a recent speaking engagement, and 2 people came up to me afterward, and they were a couple, and they were both autistic, and they were adorable and lovely. And they said that they wanted to come and see me speak because they were working through some things in their relationship, and they thought it would be helpful to hear me speak, and they said that it meant so much to hear what I had to say, and that it made a difference for them. And I was almost crying when I heard
Oh,
that.
I'm almost cried. That's so wonderful. I know the work you're doing is so powerful and important, and you're this voice that needs to be heard, and more voices need to join you, Amy. What final piece of advice would you give to our listeners who are ready to embrace love in their midlife and maybe autistic or on the spectrum?
Well, I would say, I mean, first, first to the people who might love or be supporting someone who's on the spectrum, even though we have these differences, we have so many similarities as well. We are so much more alike than we are different as autistic and neurodivergent people. We have the same desire to love and to be loved that other people do. The challenge is finding people who will honor and respect that love and treat us the way that we deserve to be treated. For me, I repeatedly have found myself being someone that others, men particularly, have used to feel better about themselves. They have been in places of whatever it was they needed an ego boost, and they found me perhaps convenient for that purpose. But then I'm left bereft, and I'm left feeling like I'm good for the short term, but not wanted for the long term. And that's been a very painful thing. I said, develop that ethos of, if you can't handle my tears, you don't deserve my cheers. That's what that means. Is that if you the other way I describe it is I talk about people sticking around long enough to know the toast part of me. And the toast part of me is that when I have toast at home, I only put butter on it, usually. But when I'm out somewhere at a hotel or staying somewhere, I always put jelly, because the butter brands are different when you're out somewhere. If it's not one I like, then I'm not going to like it. But nobody stuck around long enough, at least since my college boyfriend, to get to know that toast part of me, to get to know those mundane little things that we learn about someone when we're in a relationship with them. And so I want someone to know the toast part of me. And to all the people out there, looking for relationships, find someone who will get to know the toast part of you, who will stick around, who will appreciate all the little intricacies that make you who you are.
Oh, that's beautiful. I love that. How can our audience members follow you and get in touch with you and maybe work with you?
That would be wonderful. Yeah, absolutely. You can find me. I have a website, amygravino.com.
It's Gravino, Amy Gravino.
Yes, and I'm on LinkedIn. I'm on Instagram at amy.gravino, and you can always send me an email at amy@amygravino.com.
That's wonderful. Well, I hope people take you up on that. You are a gem. You are incredible. You're so honest and forthright in your storytelling. I know I appreciate it. I'm sure everyone listening and watching does. And I really thank you for being our guest today. All right, everyone. Well, that is a wrap on today's episode of Plenty of Husbands. If you want to hear more wisdom and inspiration from experts like Amy, follow Plenty of Husbands on Spotify, Apple, and YouTube. We have a new episode every Wednesday, so hit that follow button. Until next week, I'm your host, Robin Fisher-Roffer, and I'm reminding you to practice your ABCs of love: action, belief, and courage. It's time to step into your next chapter and live your greatest love story. Thank you so much, Amy. Bye, everyone.